In 1772, King George, III of England, ruler of a global empire, personally locked himself in a room at his private observatory with a small silver machine, and for 10 weeks he checked it against the stars, every single day, with his own hands. The machine was a watch. Its maker was a self-taught carpenter's son named John Harrison, then 79 years old, who had spent his entire life building it and was being cheated of his reward by the scientific establishment. When the 10 weeks were up and the watch had barely drifted, the king exploded with one of the great sentences of the 18th century. "By God, Harrison, I will see you righted." The most powerful man in the world had just gone to war with his own government over the honesty of a watchmaker. That scene is not an exception in history. It is the pattern. For 500 years, kings, queens, emperors, and empires trusted watchmakers with things they would not trust to banks, to ministers, or to each other. Their navies, their fortunes, their secrets, and their escape plans. This is the full story of the watchmaker, the quiet craftsman whose little machine steered empires, and whose work became a form of money that has outlived most of the banks that ever existed. Time was church property first. The first mechanical clocks of Europe appeared in the 12 and 1300s in monasteries and cathedral towers, built to summon monks to prayer, enormous iron machines without faces or hands that simply rang bells. The clock was public, communal, and stationary. Then, around 1500, a German locksmith of Nuremberg, named Peter Henlein, aided by the invention of the coiled mainspring, built something that changed the ownership of time itself, a clock small enough to carry. The first watches were worn on chains around the neck, egg-shaped, wildly inaccurate, losing hours a day. It did not matter. A watch said something no other object could say: time itself belongs to me. Kings had to have them. Henry VIII wore one. Elizabeth I collected them by the dozen. The watch was born not as an instrument but as jewelry that happened to tick, and the watchmaker was born as a servant of crowns. Then came the strangest twist in the whole story, the accident that built the world capital of watchmaking. In 1541, the preacher John Calvin turned Geneva into the sternest religious republic in Europe, and his laws banned the wearing of jewelry and ornament as sinful vanity. Geneva was full of master jewelers and goldsmiths suddenly forbidden from practicing their trade. But a watch, the lawyers of God conceded, was not jewelry. A watch was an instrument, a tool of discipline and order. So the finest jewelers in Europe poured their genius into the one luxury still permitted, and Geneva, the city that banned beauty, became the world's factory of beautiful machines. It still is, 5 centuries later. Every Swiss watch on earth exists because of a Puritan loophole. A second accident finished the job. When France revoked the tolerance of Protestants in 1685, tens of thousands of Huguenot craftsmen fled, and the watchmakers among them carried the trade's finest secrets into Switzerland and London. Persecution, twice, delivered the world's most delicate craft into the mountains of a small, neutral country. And the Swiss added their own invention. Whole Jura valleys where farm families spent the snowed-in winters making watch parts at kitchen tables. An entire landscape organized into a single, dispersed factory. By the 1700s, the watchmaker stood at the exact center of the age's greatest scientific prize, and this is the hinge of the story, the moment the craft became a matter of empires. The problem was longitude. A ship at sea could find its latitude from the sun, but to know how far east or west it stood, it needed to compare local time with the time back home. And no clock on Earth could keep time on a rolling, damp, freezing ship. The mightiest navies on the planet were sailing half-blind, and in 1707, that blindness wrecked a British fleet on the rocks of Scilly and drowned as many as 2,000 sailors in a single night. In 1714, Parliament offered the Longitude Prize, £20,000, millions in today's money, for a solution. The greatest astronomers of Europe, Newton among them, believed the answer lay in the heavens, in tables of the moon. They were outbuilt by a carpenter from Yorkshire. John Harrison, with no formal training, built his first pendulum clocks out of wood, and then spent 4 decades, essentially his entire adult life, constructing 5 revolutionary sea clocks. His masterpiece, the H4, looks like an oversized pocket watch, and on its trial voyage to Jamaica in 1761, it lost about 5 seconds in 81 days at sea. The astronomers who ran the prize board, unable to believe a mere mechanic had beaten celestial mathematics, tested him, retested him, confiscated his watch, and paid him in fragments until the old man's son wrote directly to the king, and George III ran his own trial and forced Parliament's hand. Harrison received his final award at 80, 3 years before his death, and the consequence outgrew the man. Copies of his watch, the marine chronometer, went aboard the ships of Captain Cook and then the entire Royal Navy and merchant fleet. Britain's mastery of the oceans, the trade routes, the empire on which the sun never set, all of it ran on the ticking of small machines. The bankers financed the ships, but the watchmaker told them where on earth they were. And the kings kept coming, because the watchmaker sold the one thing rank could not buy elsewhere: perfection. In Paris, Abraham Louis Breguet, the greatest watchmaker who ever lived, counted Marie Antoinette, Napoleon, the kings of England and Spain, and the Tsar of Russia among his clients. In 1783, an admirer of the French queen commissioned from Breguet the most complicated watch ever conceived, with every complication known to the art, no expense capped, no deadline set. The queen went to the guillotine. Breguet himself died, and the watch, the Marie Antoinette, was finished by his son 44 years after it was ordered. It is today valued at tens of millions of dollars, and it was worth more than most banks of its era, a fact its owners understood perfectly. Because here is what royalty had grasped about the watchmaker's product. A great watch was wealth in its most loyal form. A bank could fail, and banks failed constantly. A currency could rot. An estate could be confiscated by the next revolution. But a masterpiece watch was a fortune that fit in a pocket, crossed any border, spoke every language, and could be sold in any city on earth. It was the original offshore account, worn on a chain. History kept proving the point in the cruelest ways. Through every collapse of the 20th century, war, hyperinflation, revolution, refugees who could not move money out of dying countries moved watches instead, sewn into coat linings, traded for passage, for visas, for lives. A gold watch crossing a border was a bank transfer no regime could block. To this day, the phrase "a patek on the wrist" is understood in every unstable economy on earth as what it has always been: crisis money. The craft itself nearly died twice. First, American mass production in the 1800s turned the watch from a nobleman's treasure into a workingman's tool, and after a horrific 1891 train collision in Ohio, caused by an engineer's watch that had stopped for 4 minutes, American railroads imposed brutal accuracy standards, making the railroad watch one of the first precision objects ordinary people ever owned. Then came the real extinction event: quartz. In 1969, Seiko of Japan released the first quartz wristwatch, powered by a vibrating crystal, more accurate than the finest mechanical movement ever made, and soon absurdly cheap. The Swiss industry, 1,600 companies and 90,000 workers strong, collapsed to a third of its size in barely a decade. The 500-year-old craft was, by every economic logic, obsolete. What saved it is the most instructive twist in this entire story. The watchmakers stopped selling time. A visionary named Nicholas Hayek rescued the wreckage of the Swiss industry in the 1980s with the cheap, joyful swatch to pay the bills, and then repositioned the mechanical watch as the opposite of a tool. As art, heritage, and permanent value, the only machine a man buys knowing his phone keeps better time. It worked beyond all reason. Swiss watch exports today run around $26 billion a year, from a country of 9 million people, and the industry sells fewer watches than decades ago for more money than ever. At the top, the watch has completed its return to the age of kings. Paul Newman's own Rolex Daytona sold at auction for $17.8 million. A Patek Philippe Grandmaster chime sold in 2019 for $31 million, the most expensive watch ever auctioned. Steel Rolexes carry waiting lists of years and resell above retail like appreciating securities. And finance houses now track vintage watches as an asset class alongside art and gold, one that has outperformed the stock market across some stretches. Patek Philippe's famous advertisement states the 5-century-old truth in one line: you never actually own one, you merely look after it for the next generation. That is not a slogan about sentiment. It is a slogan about a store of value. So, think back to old John Harrison, waiting decades for a prize, while his little machine quietly held the answer to an empire's greatest problem. Kings trusted watchmakers more than banks for a reason that has never changed. A bank sells promises, and promises depend on politics, on solvency, on luck. A watchmaker sells accumulated human perfection, metal taught to be honest, and honesty of that kind keeps its value through revolutions, defaults, and centuries. The tick was never really the product. Permanence is the product. That's not an accident. That's the business model. The craft that steered navies and hid fortunes now sits on wrists next to phones that mock its accuracy, and it has never been worth more. The least you can do, next time you pass a watch shop window, is know that you are not looking at instruments. You are looking at the oldest reliable bank on Earth, and it never once needed a bailout. If this video changed how you look at that little machine on your wrist, subscribe, because next we're covering more everyday crafts with histories they forgot to warn you about.